I sat in my modest apartment, staring at the eviction notice my daughter had just slapped down on my coffee table. Her husband stood behind her, arms crossed, wearing that same cold smile he'd perfected over the years. They thought I was just a broke old man, dependent on their charity. "Dad, you can't keep living like this," Sarah said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "The Sunset Manor has a lovely room available. You'll be so much happier there." But what they didn't know was that the struggling old man they were trying to warehouse wasn't who they thought he was. They had no idea what I'd been planning for the past 3 years, or that their perfect scheme was about to backfire in the most devastating way possible. What happened next would cost them everything they thought they owned, and reveal a truth that would shatter their world forever. Before we continue, please subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories. Hit that like and subscribe button if you believe karma always finds a way. Now, let's see how this family's greed led to their ultimate downfall. Let me take you back to where this all started. 3 years ago, when my beloved wife Margaret passed away, I made a decision that would change everything. As I stood at her graveside, watching my daughter Sarah barely contain her impatience during the service, I saw something that broke my heart more than Margaret's death ever could. She wasn't mourning her mother. She was calculating her inheritance. I'd built Hayes Industries from nothing, a small construction company that grew into a real estate empire worth nearly $1 billion. Margaret and I had lived modestly, preferring to reinvest in the business rather than flaunt our wealth. We thought we were teaching Sarah the value of hard work and humility. Instead, we'd raised a woman who saw dollar signs where she should have seen love. The day after Margaret's funeral, Sarah and her husband David came to my home office. They'd prepared a presentation, actual PowerPoint slides about optimizing my assets and securing my future. David, who worked as a mid-level financial advisor, spoke about me like I wasn't in the room. "The old man needs guidance," he said, clicking through charts that broke down my supposed finances. "He's clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of Margaret's estate. We should consider establishing a conservatorship." That word hit me like a physical blow. Conservatorship. They wanted to have me declared incompetent so they could control my money. Sarah nodded along, adding, "Dad's been so forgetful lately." Yesterday he couldn't remember where he put his reading glasses. I had been wearing them on my head at the time. That night, lying in the bed I'd shared with Margaret for 43 years, I made my decision. If my daughter wanted to play games with a helpless old man, I'd give her exactly what she expected. But I'd also give her a lesson she'd never forget. The next morning I called my lawyer, my financial advisor, and my most trusted business partner. Within a week, I had orchestrated the most elaborate deception of my life. On paper, Hayes Industries was sold to a consortium of investors. In reality, I'd transferred everything to a series of shell companies and offshore trusts, all controlled by me under the identity of Harrison Webb. To the outside world, including my daughter, Thomas Hayes had received a modest buyout of $2.3 million, most of which went to outstanding debts and taxes. The grieving widower was left with just enough to scrape by. I moved out of our family home, claiming I couldn't afford the upkeep. I found a small apartment in a middle-class neighborhood and began the performance of a lifetime. I shopped with coupons, complained about the cost of groceries, and let my daughter believe she was supporting me with her occasional $200 checks. Meanwhile, as Harrison Webb, I continued running my empire from a downtown penthouse office that my struggling identity had never seen. For 3 years, I watched and waited, I documented every condescending comment, every eye roll when I asked about my complicated finances, every time they spoke about me in the third person while I sat right there. But what I learned during those 3 years broke my heart in ways I never expected. It wasn't just about the money. They genuinely believed I was becoming a burden. David complained to his friends about the crazy old man who called too often. Sarah told her book club that she was basically raising a third child because of my needs. When I had a minor heart episode last year, nothing serious, but it required an overnight hospital stay, I overheard them in the hallway discussing options. "We can't keep doing this," David said. "He's only going to get worse. Sunset Manor takes Medicare, and once he's there, we can sell his apartment to cover the costs." "I know," Sarah replied. "I just feel guilty." "But you're right. We have to think about our own future." As I lay in that hospital bed, connected to monitors, and feeling genuinely vulnerable for the first time in years, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about teaching them a lesson anymore. It was about discovering who they really were when they thought no one was watching. The answer was more devastating than I'd imagined. They didn't love me. They tolerated me. And soon they'd try to warehouse me so they wouldn't have to do even that. But they'd made one critical error in their calculations. They assumed that a sick, confused old man couldn't fight back. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The morning they brought me the eviction notice, I was ready for them. I'd been Harrison Webb for so long that slipping back into the role of helpless Thomas Hayes felt like putting on a worn, familiar coat. I let my hands shake as I picked up the paper. I squinted at it like I couldn't understand the legal language. I even let my voice quaver as I spoke. "Eviction? But I've been paying my rent." David stepped forward, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "Tom, you missed 3 months of payments. We've been covering them, but we can't afford to keep doing it." That was their first lie. I'd never missed a payment. In fact, as Harrison Webb, I'd been the one providing the money they claimed they were spending on me. Every dollar they gave me was actually my own money, filtered through accounts they didn't know existed. "We've been talking," Sarah said, sitting down beside me on the couch with exaggerated gentleness. "Sunset Manor really is the best option. You'll have round-the-clock care, activities, people your own age to talk to." "And," David added, consulting his tablet, "once we sell your apartment and liquidate your remaining assets, the proceeds should cover about 18 months of care. After that, Medicare and Medicaid will take over." I blinked at him, playing confused. "Sell my apartment? But where will I go when I visit?" The look that passed between them was everything I needed to see. Sarah's expression was pure pity mixed with impatience. David's was barely concealed irritation. "Dad," Sarah said slowly, as if speaking to a child, "you won't be visiting. Sunset Manor will be your home, your new home." They'd brought papers with them. Pre-filled forms for the nursing home admission, power of attorney documents that would give them control over my finances, and a real estate listing agreement for my apartment. "We just need you to sign here, here, and here," David said, producing an expensive pen. "Don't worry about reading all the details. We've reviewed everything with our lawyers." I stared at the papers, letting them think I was struggling to understand. Inside, I was marveling at their efficiency. They'd planned this down to the smallest detail, right down to the pen I'd used to sign away my freedom. "I don't understand," I said finally. "How long would I be at this place?" "Permanently, Dad," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "You need more help than we can give you." There it was, the word that confirmed everything I'd suspected. Permanently. I looked up at my daughter. This woman I'd raised, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged and whose nightmares I'd chased away. She was looking at me like I was a problem to be solved, not a person to be loved. Can I have a few minutes to think about it?" I asked. David checked his watch. "Tom, we really need to get this done today. The room at Sunset Manor won't hold indefinitely." But Sarah must have seen something in my expression that concerned her. Maybe a flicker of the man I used to be. "Of course, Dad. Why don't you go make some tea while David and I discuss the logistics?" I stood up slowly, playing up the arthritis that was actually quite manageable, and shuffled toward the kitchen. But I didn't go far. I positioned myself just around the corner where I could hear every word. "He's getting worse," David said immediately. "Did you see how confused he looked?" "We're doing the right thing." "I know," Sarah replied. "It's just, God, I remember when he used to be so sharp. He ran that company like a general commanding an army." "That was a long time ago, honey. People age, their minds go. It's not his fault, but it's not our responsibility to sacrifice our lives for his decline." "What about the apartment?" she asked. "How much do you think we'll get for it?" "I talked to a realtor. In this market, probably around $180,000. After we pay off his remaining debts and cover the moving costs, there should be about $150,000 left." "That's not bad," Sarah said. "We could put it toward Emma's college fund." They were dividing up my assets like I was already dead. Worse, they were doing it while I stood 15 feet away, invisible to them in my own home. But the worst part was still coming. "You know what I keep thinking about?" David said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That old life insurance policy of his. The one from the company? What about it? It's still valid. $500,000 payout, and at his age, with his health issues. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. I gripped the kitchen counter to steady myself, not from infirmity, but from pure rage. They weren't just planning to warehouse me. They were planning to profit from my death. I took several deep breaths, reminding myself that anger was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not yet. I had one chance to get this right, and everything depended on my next move. When I returned to the living room, I was carrying a cup of tea with hands that trembled just enough to be believable. "I've been thinking," I said, settling back into my chair. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I do need more help than I realized." Their faces lit up with relief, and something that might have been genuine affection if I hadn't just heard them calculating my death benefits. "That's wonderful, Dad," Sarah said, squeezing my hand. "You're going to love it at Sunset Manor. They have a beautiful garden, and the food is supposed to be excellent." I nodded, playing the grateful but scared old man. "There is one thing, though." "What's that?" David asked, pen poised over the papers. "I'd like my lawyer to review these documents first, just to make sure I understand everything." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Dad," Sarah said carefully, "we've already had our lawyers look at everything. It's all standard paperwork." "I'm sure it is," I replied, clutching my teacup like a security blanket. "But Margaret always said I should never sign anything without my lawyer reading it first. You remember Mr. Patterson, don't you?" David's jaw tightened. "Tom, lawyers cost money, money you don't really have to spare." "It'll just be a quick consultation," I said, maintaining my confused but stubborn demeanor. "Maybe $200? They exchanged another look. I could see them calculating whether it was worth the expense to maintain the illusion of legitimacy. "Fine," Sarah said finally, "but let's get this scheduled for tomorrow. The room at Sunset Manor really won't wait much longer." After they left, I sat in my modest apartment surrounded by the props of my carefully constructed poverty. Then I walked to my bedroom closet and moved aside the winter coats. Behind them was a small safe that Sarah and David had never bothered to investigate. Inside were the keys to my real life. I dialed a number I'd memorized 3 years ago. "Jennifer Chen's office," came the crisp voice. "This is Harrison Webb," I said, my voice transforming from the shaky tone of moments before to something entirely different. "Tell Ms. Chen the wolves have finally shown their teeth. It's time." The next day, I arrived at the downtown law office exactly as planned, but I didn't go as Thomas Hayes, the confused old man. For the first time in 3 years, I walked into that building as who I really was. Sarah and David were already in the waiting room, their confidence radiating like heat. They had their folders, their expensive pens, their perfectly rehearsed speeches about my best interests. They looked up when I entered, and something flickered across Sarah's face. Confusion. "Dad, you seem different today." Before I could answer, the office door opened, and Jennifer Chen appeared. But she wasn't the junior associate they'd expected to find representing their incompetent father. Jennifer was a senior partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms. She wore authority like expensive perfume, and when she spoke, her voice could cut glass. "Mr. Hayes," she said, extending her hand to me with obvious respect. "Thank you for coming." "And Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, I presume?" The use of their married name instead of mine was the first crack in their foundation. We followed her into a conference room designed to intimidate. Granite table, leather chairs, walls lined with legal victories, a camera in the corner, red light blinking. "Before we begin," Jennifer said, settling into her chair like a queen taking her throne, "I should inform you that this meeting is being recorded. Given the nature of the documents you're asking Mr. Hayes to sign, it's essential." David shifted uncomfortably. "Is that really necessary?" "Oh, it's absolutely necessary," Jennifer replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "especially considering the conversations you've been having about Mr. Hayes's future." She opened a laptop, and suddenly the room filled with David's voice. "The old man needs guidance." He's clearly overwhelmed. Sarah's face went white as she heard herself. "Dad's been so forgetful lately." But the worst was yet to come. Jennifer fast-forwarded to yesterday's conversation. David's voice filled the room. "That old life insurance policy, $500,000 payout, and at his age, with his health issues." The silence that followed was deafening. "That conversation," Jennifer said calmly, "constitutes conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. Possibly worse, depending on how a prosecutor interprets your intentions." "You can't record us without consent," David shouted. Jennifer slid a document across the table. An authorization form, signed and notarized. The signature read, "Harrison Webb." "Who the hell is Harrison Webb?" Sarah demanded. That's when I stood up. For 3 years, I'd been hunched and shuffling. Now I rose to my full height, shoulders back, with the presence of a man who commanded boardrooms and built empires. "Harrison Webb," I said, my voice carrying an authority Sarah hadn't heard since she was a child, "is who I've always been. The question isn't who Harrison Webb is." I looked directly into my daughter's eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, I let her see the real me. The question is, who is Thomas Hayes? Jennifer activated another screen. Corporate documents flashed by. Property records, bank statements, photographs of me in business suits, shaking hands with governors, accepting awards, commanding respect. But she stopped at one particular document, a property deed for Sunset Manor. "Harrison Webb," Jennifer said quietly, "is the owner of the nursing home where you plan to warehouse your father." The blood drained from David's face. "That's impossible." "What's impossible," I said, walking around the table to stand behind them, "is that you chose to imprison me in my own facility. I've been watching you tour it, negotiate rates, plan my permanent incarceration in a building I own." Sarah turned to face me, tears streaming. "Why?" "Why would you do this to us?" I looked at this woman I'd raised, who'd been willing to sell my freedom for convenience, and felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. But there was still one more revelation coming. One more truth that would complete their destruction. Jennifer placed her hands on a final folder, thick with documents they couldn't even imagine. "Now," she said, "let's discuss what happens next." Jennifer opened the thick folder with the precision of a surgeon making the first cut. Inside were documents that would reshape everything Sarah and David thought they knew about their world. "Over the past 3 years," Jennifer began, her voice clinical and devastating, "you've systematically stolen $47,000 from Mr. Hayes's accounts. Small amounts, carefully timed, designed to look like legitimate support payments." She spread bank records across the granite table like evidence at a crime scene. "What you didn't realize is that every fraudulent transaction was being monitored and documented. Every dollar you gave him was actually his own money, placed in accounts you had access to specifically so we could document your theft." David's face had gone the color of old newspaper. "We were helping him." "Supporting him when he couldn't support himself." "With his own money," I said quietly, my voice carrying the weight of 3 years of deception. "I was literally paying you to steal from me so I could prove what kind of people you really were." Sarah's sobs filled the conference room, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were the desperate cries of someone watching their carefully constructed future crumble into dust. "There's more," Jennifer continued, seemingly immune to the emotional chaos she was creating. "Much more." She pulled out a second set of documents, these bearing official seals and government letterheads. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, you've been living in a house that you believed you owned free and clear. The house where you've been planning your comfortable retirement, where you thought you were building equity for your daughter's future." She slid a property deed across the table. "That house belongs to Harrison Webb. It always has. The mortgage payments you thought you were making? They were going into a trust account. You've been paying rent to live in a house owned by the man you were trying to institutionalize." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ventilation system humming 40 floors above the street. David grabbed the deed with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the legal language as if he could will it to say something different. But there it was, in black and white, Harrison Webb, sole owner. "That's impossible," he whispered. "We've lived there for 8 years. We've made every payment." "You've made every payment to an account controlled by Harrison Webb," Jennifer corrected. "Congratulations. You're excellent renters." But she wasn't finished. From her briefcase, she produced a tablet and set it on the table, the screen displaying a complex financial web that looked like a spider's diagram drawn by someone with a Ph.D. in revenge. "Your cars, Mr. Thornton. The BMW you drive, the Mercedes your wife loves so much, both are registered to Webb Holdings, a subsidiary of Harrison Webb Enterprises. You've been making lease payments, not car payments." Sarah's head snapped up, mascara streaming down her cheeks like black tears. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your entire lifestyle for the past 3 years has been funded by the man you were planning to rob of his dignity and freedom. Your house, your cars, your daughter's private school tuition that you thought was such a sacrifice, all of it paid for by Harrison Webb. Jennifer turned the tablet toward them, showing bank transfers, payment schedules, a financial house of cards that had been carefully constructed and was now being systematically demolished. Even the vacation you took last summer to Europe, the one where you complained so bitterly about having to cut it short because of your father's medical emergency, that $15,000 trip was paid for by a Harrison Webb account. I watched my daughter's face cycle through emotions like a slot machine that couldn't land on the right combination. Confusion, rage, disbelief, terror, all of them flashing across her features as the magnitude of her situation became clear. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this to us?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline that included dozens of buildings my companies had constructed. Buildings that bore no Hayes Industries signs, no monuments to my ego, just solid structures that served their communities well. "Do you remember," I said without turning around, "the last conversation we had before your mother died? The real conversation, not the one where you were planning my future." Sarah was quiet, but I could see her reflection in the window, thinking. "You told me that taking care of elderly parents was something previous generations had to do because they didn't have the resources we have now. You said that with proper planning, families could avoid that burden entirely." I turned back to face them. "The word you used was burden, Sarah. You called loving your father a burden that modern families shouldn't have to bear." The memory hung in the air between us, toxic and undeniable. "That's when I knew," I continued. "That's when I understood that you weren't planning to take care of me. You were planning to dispose of me, so I decided to find out exactly how far you'd go." Jennifer pulled out another document, this one sealed with red wax like something from another century. "This is your grandfather's will, Sarah. Your mother's father, who died when you were 12. Sarah looked confused. "Grandpa Joe? What does he have to do with anything?" "Everything," I said, taking the document from Jennifer, "because the story your mother told you about his death wasn't the whole truth." I broke the seal and unfolded pages that hadn't seen daylight in 23 years. "Your grandfather didn't die of a heart attack in his sleep like your mother told you. He died alone in a state nursing home where your mother had placed him against his will. She had him declared incompetent, took control of his finances, and warehoused him in a facility where he lived for 3 miserable years before he gave up and died." Sarah's face went white. "That's not true." "Mom loved Grandpa Joe. Your mother loved Grandpa Joe's house, which she sold the day after his funeral. She loved his savings account, which she drained to pay for your private school. She loved his life insurance policy, which funded the down payment on our first real house. I set the will on the table between us, but she didn't love him enough to let him live with dignity. And when he tried to fight back, to reclaim control of his own life, she had him medicated into submission. The truth was a physical weight in the room, pressing down on all of us. Your mother carried that guilt her entire life, Sarah. She made me promise that no matter what happened, no matter how difficult it became, I would never let anyone do to me what she did to her father. I looked at my daughter, this woman who had become a stranger to me, and felt the full weight of genetic inevitability. But here you are," I said quietly, "following the exact same playbook. The same lies about my competence, the same concerns about my safety, the same financial motivations dressed up as love." Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "We're not like that. We were trying to help you." Help me what? I asked. Help me disappear? Help me become so invisible that you wouldn't have to think about me anymore except when the bills came due? David finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. What do you want from us? It was the first honest question either of them had asked in 3 years. Jennifer answered for me, her voice returning to its professional cadence. Mr. Webb is prepared to offer you a choice. You can accept responsibility for your actions, make full restitution for the money you've stolen, and agree to a restraining order that will prevent any further contact with him. Or, Sarah asked, or we proceed with full criminal prosecution, elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud. Given the amounts involved and your victim's age, you're looking at felony charges with prison sentences of 5 to 10 years each. The mathematics of their situation was simple and brutal. They had been caught in an elaborate trap that had taken 3 years to construct and 30 minutes to spring. There's something else, Jennifer said, producing one final document. Something you need to understand about your daughter, Emma. At the mention of my granddaughter's name, both Sarah and David leaned forward with desperate attention. Emma's college fund, the one you've been so proudly contributing to, telling her what good providers you are, what sacrifices you're making for her future. She slid a bank statement across the table. That fund contains $847,000, every penny deposited by Harrison Webb over the past 8 years. Your contributions amount to less than 3% of the total. Sarah grabbed the statement, her eyes scanning the numbers as if they were written in a foreign language. But more importantly, Jennifer continued, Emma has known the truth for 6 months. The silence that followed was different from the others. This wasn't the silence of shock or revelation. This was the silence of a family disintegrating in real time. "What do you mean she knows?" David asked. I pulled out my phone and set it on the table, the screen showing a text message thread. Emma is 14 now, not the little girl you've been protecting from the complexities of adult life. She's smart, curious, and she asked me directly why her parents were talking about putting me in a nursing home when I seemed perfectly capable of taking care of myself. I scrolled through messages that showed a young woman grappling with the realization that her parents weren't the people she thought they were. I didn't tell her everything, I said, but I told her enough. I told her about the lies you've been telling her about who was paying for her school, her clothes, her activities. I told her about your plans for me. Sarah's voice was barely audible. What did she say? I looked at the last message in the thread, sent just that morning. She said she was ashamed to be your daughter. She said she wanted to come live with me because she couldn't trust people who would lie to her about everything that mattered. The devastation on Sarah's face was complete and absolute. In trying to secure their financial future, they had lost not just their freedom and their assets, but their daughter's respect and love. So, here's what happens now, I said, standing up and walking back to the window. You have 24 hours to decide. Take the deal Jennifer has offered, or face the consequences of your choices in court. I turned back to them one last time. But either way, you'll do it without Emma. She's moving in with me this weekend, and she'll stay there until she's old enough to decide for herself whether she wants a relationship with parents who taught her that love is just another word for financial opportunity. As they gathered their useless papers and prepared to leave, Sarah turned back one last time. "Dad," she said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I looked at this woman I had raised, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose dreams I had funded, whose future I had tried to secure, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel: peace. "I know you are, Sarah," I said, "but sorry doesn't change the fact that you were willing to trade my dignity for your convenience. Sorry doesn't erase 3 years of lies and manipulation." I walked to the door and held it open for them. Sorry is what people say when they get caught, not when they're making the choice to do wrong in the first place. After they left, Jennifer and I sat in the conference room, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal and my revenge. "How do you feel?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. The man who had walked into this room 3 hours ago had been carrying the weight of 3 years of secrets, lies, and carefully orchestrated deception. The man sitting here now felt lighter, cleaner, like someone who had finally set down a burden he'd been carrying for too long. "Free," I said finally. For the first time in 3 years, I feel free. 24 hours later, I was sitting in my penthouse office when Jennifer called with the news I'd been expecting but dreading. "They took the deal," she said. "Full restitution, restraining order, supervised probation. No criminal charges." I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt empty. "And Emma?" "She's waiting downstairs with her suitcases." "Thomas?" "She's been crying for 2 days straight. This is destroying her." I looked out at the city I'd helped build, at the empire I'd constructed through decades of honest work, and wondered if the price of justice was worth a 14-year-old girl's broken heart. "Send her up," I said. When the elevator doors opened, Emma stepped out looking like a ghost of herself. Her eyes were red and swollen, her usual bright smile replaced by the hollow expression of someone who'd lost faith in everything she thought was real. She set down her suitcases and looked around the penthouse office she'd never seen before, the real headquarters of Harrison Webb, the grandfather she was only now learning to know. "Is this who you really are?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I walked over and knelt down so we were eye to eye, this girl who carried my blood and my hope for the future. "Yes," I said simply, "this is who I've always been. But I'm also the grandfather who taught you to fish, who helped you with your science projects, who listens when you talk about your dreams." She nodded, but tears were flowing again. "I don't understand why they lied to me." "About everything, about the money, about you, about who was really taking care of our family." I took her hands in mine, feeling their smallness, their youth, their innocence that had been shattered by adult greed and deception. "Your parents made choices based on fear, Emma. They were afraid they wouldn't have enough money, afraid they wouldn't be able to give you the life they wanted for you, afraid that taking care of me would limit their options. But that's not an excuse for lying." "No," I agreed. "It's not." She pulled away and walked to the window, looking down at the street 47 floors below. "Mom keeps calling me. She says you brainwashed me, that you turned me against them. She says none of this is real, that you're just a confused old man playing games with lawyers and fake documents." The last desperate lies of people who couldn't accept the reality of their situation. "What do you think?" I asked. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window. "I think," she said finally, "that parents who really loved me wouldn't have lied to me for 14 years about who was paying for my life." Over the next few months, Emma and I built a new kind of relationship, not the occasional visits and supervised interactions of before, but the daily reality of living together, learning about each other, figuring out how to be a family of two. I enrolled her in a new school, one where she could make friends without the burden of her parents' reputation following her. She threw herself into her studies with the fierce determination of someone trying to prove herself worthy of the investment being made in her future. But it wasn't all smooth. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep, missing her parents despite everything they'd done. There were days when she lashed out at me, blaming me for destroying her family, for forcing her to choose sides in a war she'd never wanted to fight. "You could have just talked to them," she said during one particularly difficult evening. "You could have told them who you really were instead of playing these games." She was right, of course, but she was also young enough to believe that honesty was always met with honesty, that love was always stronger than greed. "I tried talking to them for 48 years," I said gently. "The last 3 years were just me documenting who they became when they thought I couldn't fight back. 6 months after the confrontation, I was in my garden behind the penthouse. Yes, there was a garden 47 floors up, one of the perks of owning the building, when Emma brought me a letter. "It's from Mom," she said, her voice carefully neutral. I opened it, expecting more of the desperate pleas and accusations I'd been receiving weekly. Instead, I found something different. "Dear Dad," it began, and for the first time in years, Sarah had called me Dad instead of Thomas or Tom. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I've been going to therapy, real therapy, not the kind where I complain about how unfair life is, but the kind where I have to look at my own actions and take responsibility for them. Dr. Martinez helped me understand something I didn't want to see. You weren't the problem in our relationship. I was. I turned you into a project instead of a person, a problem to be managed instead of a father to be loved. I know I can't undo 3 years of lies and manipulation. I know I can't take back the things David and I said about you when we thought you couldn't hear. I know I can't erase the fact that we were willing to trade your dignity for our convenience. But I want you to know that I'm trying to become someone different, someone who would make you proud instead of ashamed, someone who deserves to be Emma's mother instead of just someone who gave birth to her. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for money or help or anything else. I'm just asking for the chance to earn back some small piece of your respect, even if it takes the rest of my life. I love you, Dad. I think I forgot that for a while, but I never stopped loving you. I just stopped knowing how to show it without making it about what I could get instead of what I could give. Your daughter, I hope I still get to use that word, Sarah?" I read the letter twice, then handed it to Emma. She read it silently, her face cycling through emotions I was learning to recognize: hope, doubt, anger, love, fear. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think," she said carefully, "that people can change, but I also think they have to prove it, not just say it. Wisdom beyond her years, this granddaughter of mine. So what do we do?" Emma folded the letter carefully and handed it back to me. "We wait," she said. "We see if she means it or if it's just more words designed to get what she wants." A year later, I was standing in the same conference room where I'd destroyed my daughter's world, but this time the atmosphere was different. Tentative, careful, but not hostile. Sarah sat across from me, but she looked like a different person. Thinner, older, but also somehow more solid, more real than the woman who'd tried to warehouse me in my own nursing home. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, and her voice carried none of the entitled expectation I remembered. Emma sat beside me, now 15, and even more formidable than she'd been at 14. She'd grown into her intelligence, her strength, her unwillingness to accept easy answers or comfortable lies. "Mom's been working at the community center," Emma said without preamble, "helping elderly people navigate Medicare paperwork and financial scams. She's been doing it for 6 months, 50 hours a week, for no pay." I looked at Sarah, studying her face for signs of performance, manipulation, the calculated emotion I'd learned to recognize during those terrible 3 years. Instead, I saw something I hadn't seen since she was a child: genuine humility. I needed to understand, Sarah said quietly, what it felt like to be on the other side, to be someone's last hope instead of someone's burden. She pulled out a folder, but this time it wasn't full of legal documents designed to strip away my autonomy. "These are letters," she said, "from people I've helped. Elderly people who are being scammed by their own children, isolated by their families, treated like problems instead of people." She slid the folder across the table. "I see you in every one of them, Dad. I see the man I tried to break, and I understand now what I almost destroyed." I opened the folder and found dozens of handwritten thank-you notes, stories of people whose lives had been saved by my daughter's intervention, testimonials to the person she was trying to become. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice growing even quieter. "David and I are getting divorced." Emma straightened in her chair. "Why?" "Because I finally understood that I married someone who saw people as assets instead of human beings, someone who looked at my father's vulnerability and saw opportunity instead of responsibility." She looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. "I can't undo what we did to you, Dad. I can't take back the years we treated you like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be loved. But I can make sure I never become that person again." "And David?" Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "David is still fighting the restitution payments. He still believes we were justified in what we tried to do. He still thinks you manipulated us instead of us manipulating you." She paused, gathering herself. "That's when I knew I had to choose. Between the man who taught me that love was a transaction and the father who showed me that love was a gift, even when that gift was used against him." I closed the folder and looked at my daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in years. The entitled woman who'd tried to sell my dignity was gone. In her place sat someone who looked tired, scarred, but genuinely different. Someone who'd been broken down and rebuilt from the inside. "What do you want, Sarah?" I asked. "I want to earn back the right to be your daughter," she said simply. "Not your heir, not your dependent, not your problem. Your daughter." Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "I think," Emma said, looking between us, "that families are worth fighting for, even when they disappoint you, even when they hurt you, even when they have to be rebuilt from scratch." She squeezed her mother's hand. "But they have to be built on truth this time. No more lies about money or who's paying for what or who needs help. Just truth." I looked at my daughter and my granddaughter, these two women who represented both the greatest disappointment and the greatest hope of my life. "Truth is a good foundation," I said finally. "Let's see what we can build on it." 2 years later, I was back in that same garden, 47 floors above the city, but this time I wasn't alone. Emma, now 17 and preparing for college, was reading acceptance letters from universities across the country. Sarah was beside her, no longer the entitled woman who'd tried to warehouse me, but not yet fully the person she was trying to become. We were all works in progress. "Harvard, MIT, Stanford," Emma announced, waving the letters. "Full scholarships to all of them." "Earned scholarships," I corrected, "based on your merit, not my money." It was an important distinction. Emma's academic achievements belonged to her alone, funded by her intelligence and determination, not by the Harrison Webb fortune that would someday be hers to steward. Sarah looked up from the grant application she was working on. She was starting a nonprofit to help families avoid the kind of financial elder abuse she'd once perpetrated. "I'm proud of her," she said simply. "I'm proud of both of you," I replied, and meant it. The woman sitting in my garden bore little resemblance to the daughter who'd tried to sell my freedom 2 years ago. The process of rebuilding trust had been slow, painful, full of setbacks and small victories, but it had been real. "There's something I need to tell you both," I said, setting down my coffee cup. They looked up with the immediate attention I'd learned to expect when I used that particular tone. "I've made a decision about the Harrison Webb fortune." Emma's expression didn't change. She'd grown up knowing that money could be a blessing or a curse, depending on how it was used. Sarah tensed slightly, old habits dying hard. "The business empire will continue, but it will be restructured as a foundation focused on protecting vulnerable elderly people from financial abuse. Emma will chair the board when she turns 25, but only if she wants to. If she chooses a different path, the foundation will be run by professionals who share our values." I looked at my daughter, the woman who'd learned the hard way that love couldn't be bought or sold. "Sarah, you'll have a position on the board if you want it once you've completed your 5-year commitment to your nonprofit work. You understand now what financial abuse looks like from the inside. That knowledge could help protect other families from making the mistakes you made." Emma grinned. "So we're going to be professional good guys?" "We're going to be people who use our resources to protect the powerless instead of exploiting them," I corrected. "There's a difference." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they were different tears than the ones she'd shed in that conference room 2 years ago. These were tears of gratitude, of possibility, of a future that included redemption instead of just consequences. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," I said. "Thank me when you've spent the next 20 years proving that people can change, that families can heal, that love is stronger than greed." As the sun set over the city I'd helped build, I looked at my daughter and granddaughter and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope for the future. Not because they were perfect, but because they were real. Not because they couldn't disappoint me again, but because they'd learned the price of disappointment and chosen to pay it rather than repeat it. The silent millionaire's revenge was complete, but more importantly, the broken family's healing had begun. And in the end, that was worth more than all the money in the world. This story proves that the greatest victories aren't about destroying your enemies. They're about giving the people you love the chance to become better than they were. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is showing someone who they could be instead of punishing them for who they've been. True wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the relationships we choose to rebuild and the values we pass on to the next generation.